Hello, my name is Tolg and I exist, therefore I think too much. I am reading Fred's Beyond Good and Evil. I'm calling it Fred because I will never appease the many people who pronounce his name differently. I rant, I rant, so I'm taking these 2 points at a time, which means I'm not really getting through this book too quickly. And I cuss. So this is your forewarning. Go away if you don't like cussing. Thank you for being here if you do like cussing. And any, supposition, any judgment call I make, I'm not asserting myself as the end-all be-all knowledge bank for what the fuck goes on. So, feel free to argue me. Absolutely. I just don't intend for this to come across as though I feel like my opinion is more substantiated than anybody else's. Unless you've got a really wild one like Fred hated mustaches. Okay. So I am on chapter 2, The Free Spirit. And he doesn't believe freedom exists, I think. At least that's what I understood of it. And I'm on point 36, which is hella long. So we'll see if I get to 37. Alright, 36. Supposing that nothing else is given as real, but our world of desires and passions, that we cannot sink or rise to any other reality but just that of our impulses. Okay, this is a supposition, so fine. For thinking is only a relation of these impulses to one another. Is that true? I can't agree with that. Thinking is what's born from impulses? Thinking is born from observation. Is observation an impulse? It could be. Are we not permitted to make the attempt and to ask the question whether this which is given does not suffice? Christians do it all the time. They hate this world. By means of our counterparts for the understanding, even of the so-called mechanical or material world. I do not mean as an illusion, a semblance, or a representation in the Berkeleyan and Schopenhauerian, that's really difficult to say, sense. But as possessing the same degree of reality as our emotions themselves. Holy shit. Our emotions are granted the same reality that the world exists in? Well, okay, he did just understand that the world may not exist as we perceive it. In that regard, then, yeah, our emotions can exist without our perception being an object of truth in relation to understanding our emotions. So in that respect, they resemble one another. As a more primitive form of the world of emotions, but in which everything still lies locked in a mighty unity, which afterwards branches off and develops itself in organic processes. Oh, I am lost. So this is a part of the sentence initially, but it is separated by hyphens at the beginning and at the end of what I just said, with an added parentheses I didn't actually say out loud, which then insinuates that this is a part of the sentence that is supposed to be a side note. However, as a more primitive form of the world of emotions, suddenly we're introducing the world of emotions. Oh, I went way too abstract in my brain. Okay, I'm sorry. just trying to focus on the reality of emotions, I assume, is what that intends to paint artistically, in which everything still lies locked in a mighty unity. That's, I think, the part that's confusing me. Is it expected that people's emotions are unified? Or are they unified in that they are owned, felt, had by one individual? And that is the unification? The unification is the source? That'd be the only way I could find understanding for that sentiment. Which afterwards branches off and develops itself in organic processes. Okay, yeah, I think it's... the unity is the unified source of the emotion, and then the emotions themselves branch off once had, creating a depth to the emotion more than an origin. The parentheses is naturally also refines and debilitates. He suffers his emotions. Ditto bread. I think I said bread. Ditto bread. Bread man. Alright, sorry. As a kind of instinctive life in which all organic functions, including self-regulation, assimilation, nutrition, secretion, and change of matter, isn't secretion change of matter, are still synthetically united with one another. Well, I don't think that needed to be said. Oh, also, assimilation is an organic function. I don't think it's organic. There was a debate I was listening to about some fucking term. Blank slate theory. Debate? Can it be a debate if it's from one source? I'm not sure. But they were explaining the blank slate theory, and that I think liberalism and Marxism depends on the blank slate theory existing. And in that was brought up nature and nurture. And the blank slate theory argues that everybody would be essentially the same individual had the nurture not shifted them into a different type of person from one another. That individuality is a sentiment of nurture, not nature. At which point, I can't agree with that at all. Not only do I disagree with blank slate theory, but not that nurture wouldn't add into people being individuals, but I don't think it's scientifically possible. I mean, given you just take into consideration psychology, certain traits felt strongly enough through chemical neurons receiving and firing can be handed down generationally. In that alone, people don't start off equal at all. For all of this to say that, and I mentioned it prior in one of the videos where I mentioned the movie There's Something Wrong with Kenny, or We Need to Talk About Kenny, that I thoroughly believe it's both nature and nurture that creates a person. And blank slate theory indicates that nurture is not a necessary means by which a human is created. It shouldn't exist, or it's almost a perceived evil. I don't remember how it was addressed, but it wasn't necessarily a positive in the eyes of blank slate. And I totally ranted to the point that I forgot why I was mentioning it. Oh, assimilation. I think assimilation is a part of nurture rather than nature. Go along to get along. That's what, it's a survival mechanism. I don't think that it is a naturally formed survival mechanism more than it's an inherited survival mechanism from hunter-gatherer, and again, re-referencing a zillionth time tribalism, that it is an inherited ideology pertaining to tribalism and the need to belong to a tribe to secure resources. Also heavily dependent on the presumption that resources are inadequate, a limited source. So, ta-da! All of this to say, I don't think it's inherent to human nature to assimilate. I think that's inherited nurture. And I'm wondering how long something has to exist in humanity for it to be considered nature. If it is inherited nurture from the time of hunter-gatherer societies thousands of years ago, then should we just consider it nature now? Is assimilation human nature? I always thought it was human nature to be individualistic. Maybe I'm wrong. Also, and then he goes into are still synthetically united with one another as a primary form of life, and then he puts a question mark, but primary form. I don't have depth of understanding provided for organic functions being a primary form. It can't be a primary form, it's a function of a form. So if this is a question he's asking, then no. The answer is no. Jesus Christ, that's such a run-on sentence. Any English teacher would downgrade this and say he should fucking be more direct with what he says. That's not even a question. That's a statement. Why did it end in a question mark? I do not mean as an illusion, a semblance, a representation. As a primary form of life. Question mark. If you take out all of the middle part, which is just expounding, defining in detail, the sentence makes no fucking sense. It's not a question. In the end, it is not only permitted to make this attempt, it is commanded by the conscience of logical method. Jesus Christ. You pulled logic in after 35 points of arguing with yourself? Now what is logical method? Also, why did you give it a conscience? Bum bum bum. Not to assume several kinds of causality, so long as the attempt to get along with a single one has not been pushed to its furthest extent, to absurdity, if I may be allowed to say so. Absurdism is the only reason to stay alive. In my humble opinion, it's what makes life fun. That is a morality of method which one may not repudiate nowadays. You know, for someone who has so much judgment, there's like this weird duality in Nietzsche of finding morality a subjective notion and understanding it to be a subjective notion, holding one society's morals as higher than another society's, while then saying these things like the morality of logical method or morality of method As though morality has suddenly become an objective truth. I think I started that. Look at me not finishing my sentence or getting the right sentence structure. Whoopsie daisy. For someone who does that, I don't think he follows logic while talking about logic. Could just be me. Head's in a bad state today. I also love the word repudiate, but I don't find it reasonable for me to utilize it in everyday speak. I just like how it rolls off the tongue. Repudiate. Oh, right, sorry. It follows from its definition as mathematicians say. Oh, man, I should have finished that sentence beforehand. I apologize. I think you've gotten used to it at this point, though. The question is ultimately whether we really recognize the will as operating, whether we believe in the causality of the will. A will can be influenced. And I don't know if this is a theory. I think it's a theory, but if it is a theory, I don't know the name of it. But like, someone in Milan has an idea simultaneously, and I think the theory exists on the supposition that the person closest in chemical formulation of like construct of the body would then, you know, even if they're half a world away, have that same idea because of how energy interacts with its environment, something along those lines. I'd really have to look at the theory later. Maybe I will when editing. Probably not, though. It's a lot of effort. So then, you know, causality would be one person was influenced, but for the other person, that's just similar in chemical construct. It kind of was born from nothing. But then the cause would be that someone else had it. So, yeah, there is a causality of the will. It's not born from nothing. I guess that would be the argument of, because another staple of my beliefs is that the microcosm is the macrocosm, that it's just a pattern repeating in different sized structures. And that argument goes directly against, you know, the Big Bang. No, it doesn't. Ha! Sorry. So if patterns are constantly repeating, you know, then it doesn't go against it. If the macrocosm is the microcosm and vice versa, and the Big Bang does exist and nothing existed prior to the Big Bang existing. And I'm not arguing against the Big Bang. I just argue that nothing existed prior to the Big Bang. I think even nothing is something. That the micro from the Big Bang, the microscopic pattern repeating would be that will could suddenly come from nothing. Could happen. No proof either which way, though, especially not from my position, sitting on a couch. Okay, so the question is whether we believe in the causality of the will. I do. What came first, the chicken or the egg? The will or the action? If we do so, and fundamentally our belief in this is just our belief in causality itself, we must make the attempt to posit hypothetically the causality of the will as the only causality. Okay, so he didn't intend to argue against the cause of the will, or the cause forming a will. Jesus. Reading Marguerite Porete made me understand every sensation and emotion as an entity, so now when I'm reading this, it's like difficult to divorce that understanding. And so going back to it, sorry, he's not arguing that the will is not caused by something, but that if the will is caused by something, then the only cause that ever existed ever was the will. That is the reason everything exists. It was willed. Creation theory. And that would be the pattern repeating from a creation, from an initial creation. Will can naturally only operate on will. What? You will the will to happen? No. Well, I was thinking you can will something and the will not respond. You can will to will and the will doesn't, like depression. You want to do something, but then everything in you doesn't have that drive. Depression mixed with anxiety. So I guess I have to agree with that. A will needs a will to will. And not on matter. Interesting. Not on nerves, for instance. Okay, well, I can find a disagreement for that in a natural will that may not be a cognitive will, where when one touches a hot stove coil, they don't necessarily keep their hand there if they don't have nerve damage. And by nerves alone, your hand recoils, and that is the will of the body, may not be the will of the person. The will of the nervous system, at which point is the will of the nervous system, is the nervous system a consciousness beyond your own? Spooky. In short, the hypothesis must be hazarded whether will does not operate on will wherever effects are recognized. Depends on if you believe your nervous system has a will of its own. And whether all mechanical action, inasmuch as a power operates therein, is not just the power of will, the effect of will. Granted, finally, that we succeeded in explaining our entire instinctive life as the development and ramification of one fundamental form of will. Succeeded. I don't know. Really depends on how you address the nervous system. Does the nervous system have a will beyond the consciousness of the ego? Namely, the will to power. Again, heavily depends. As my thesis puts it, granted that all organic functions could be traced back to this will to power, I think he suffers from conquest. I'm gonna call it conquest disease. It's gonna be fucking not only intoxicating, but awful. Just living life needing to conquer everything. Ever. It's gotta be fucking miserable and consuming. There's a question, probably not posed to everybody, but I think people should actually try to ask themselves, if you were king of the world, would you want to be? Hell no. I don't think enough people take into consideration that with power comes responsibility. There's, was it this book or was it Marguerite Porete? Maybe it was neither. I don't know what the fuck I was reading. Or watching? I don't know. But it was, that an individual with power needs to make decisions in such a way that the morality of the general man would not be applicable to the morality of the person in power. Because the decisions are on a grand scale. And so it's easy to say that with power comes responsibility, but I think it's more complex to understand that that level of responsibility differentiates greatly from the general sense of responsibility that each individual ought to feel towards their own lives. Because then you're responsible for more than just your own. You know, people talk about how being a parent is so fucking difficult. Okay, but like 8 billion people. I would hate to be God. Organic functions could be traced back to this will to power, and that the solution of the problem of generation and nutrition, it is one problem. To generate something and to provide nutrition for something. That is not one problem. Just because you say it is doesn't mean it makes any sense at all. Also, you introduced it and then didn't define it. The problem of generation and nutrition. What the fuck is that problem? What do you mean by that problem? The problem to... Okay, so in current modern day US politics, 2026, with hyperconservatism on the rise, we currently have a pedophile in office who is imploring everybody to give birth to more children because the birth rate of Christian individuals is declining. There's this theory amongst mostly missionary Christians, but it's easier to give birth to more Christians than to convert more Christians. And that goes in line with Christians believing that they are at war with essentially what is God. Because if your God is omnipotent, omniscient, and omnipresent, why are you fighting? What are you fighting? So anyways, these people believe that they are giving birth to generals, armies, militant, meant to move forward in the world and fight the good fight. And I think the rhetoric that the pedophilic president pushing people to have babies is going on is that it's just feeding into the people that did vote for him, which was a large Christian base, without understanding the reason for why they're aiming to give birth like 12 kids to a family. Also, side tangent rant. As I've already said something distasteful, I may as well further... No, I didn't say something distasteful. If I can't say it, it shouldn't have been done. If you can't stand by what you did, that's your fucking problem. But it's been done. The issue isn't with people talking about what you did. The issue is that you did it. That's repercussion for your actions. Sure, it's distasteful, but it ain't my fault that it is. And on a different rant, in another distasteful vein, there is a chemical phenomenon that happens when one has a child. And it is impulsory. Compulsory? No, impulse. It is impulse. It's just nature. Survival of the organic material that is human race. Which is you are pumped with oxytocin. It's the chemical drive, I think oxytocin mixed with dopamine. It's a chemical drive in a mother to protect their young. So, you know, it goes fucking awry when someone suffers from postpartum depression, or it would go awry if someone generally suffers depression. They're not going to receive the same level of oxytocin. Having said that, someone who gives birth pretty prominently and repeatedly may be an addict. And I don't think it's said, and if it's said, I don't think it's said enough. That everything you do is a chemical input and output. If you're doing something extensively and with lack of forethought for the effect of your actions, bringing 12 children into a world where you may not be able to provide for them as well as one would like, you're an addict. You're not a good parent. You just brought someone in without the ability to provide for them. That's not a duty. You're as good as any drug user out there. You're an addict. You're either addicted to the moral quandary that it raises of your own person, that you've earned your way into the Mormon heaven as a god that will procure many worlds by giving birth to many children. Or you're addicted to the chemical sensation of it, both of having sex and of having what comes from sex, a child. And it's gotta be some hell of a sensation, you know? An entire life form forming inside of you, providing. That's gotta be one hell of a feeling. So I'm not looking down on it, just as I wouldn't anybody's experiences in life. I just don't think that it deserves any more pride than anybody else's experience in life. What deserves pride isn't the experience you've had. What deserves adoration is the end result. Is the individual created from it. Whether that be you taking pride in being a parent, did you do a good job of being a parent? What was the end result of it? Can you even say that was your effort, or was it the effort of the child themselves? Ta-da! The world seen from within, the world defined and designated according to its intelligible character, it would simply be will to power and nothing else. Will to exist. I have a will to exist. I don't have a will to power. Like I said, responsibility and blech. But I have a will to exist. So therein the argument lies. No, I disagree. Point 37 starts with a question. His way of forming sentences is incredible. What? Does that not mean, in popular language, God is disproved, but not the devil? Excuse me? That's one hell of a fucking jump. Okay, and then he retorts to himself. On the contrary, my friends, and who the devil also compels you to speak popularly. And that's point 37. That's a point. That's a point. Okay, may as well. I just critiqued Mormonism. So the supposition is, if everything exists purely on the will to power, then that by Friedrich, by his understanding, that means God truly does exist, I think. Or rather, most would conclude the will to power would mean that the only one that wants power is the devil, and thus, if the will to power is the only thing to cause anything, then the only thing to exist would be the devil. And that goes in line with the devil is God. Or red-eyed Jesus. Satan is Jesus. There's so many theories out there. But if you were to go purely on Christian religion, which I think one commenter noted that he was purely talking about Christianity, or at least mostly talking about Christian theology. Omnipotent, omniscient, I don't know. But another one, where he's everything, everywhere, all the ways. Wouldn't be able to be perceived as a finite being, like the devil. The devil is easier to access therein than God, in just ideological understanding of an entity. Because everything that was created after everything existed and created it is not going to be the infinite source. It's going to be a finite part part of the infinite source. So the importance of it is going to be far less. Whether it exists or it doesn't, in Christian theology, it shouldn't matter. Your focus in Christian theology, in being a part of the Christian church at all, should have only been on God. Not on a war, not on the devil. You shouldn't give a shit. It should have only been about God for you, which is everything. Your God is everything. So focusing on Jesus may be that you have misunderstood God. Praying to Jesus is definitely not praying to God. The only thing that exists is God, but not because of the will to power, but because of will existing at all. The will to exist. Power is just a side effect, not a goal. Only a finite creature would place it as a goal. And I guess if your whole theory exists side by side with a theory that you believe in God existing, this God of everything, this Christian understanding of God, then you would have to conclude that the will to power is not the cause of all will. It would be the will to exist that is the cause of all will, and therein the only thing that exists would be God. The devil, again, wouldn't even be a part of that equation. It's just, the same as anything else existing, like the plank of wood that you walk on. It just exists. Okay, bye. Have a good night. Drink well, eat well, sleep well, and take care of yourselves.